So in this video I'm going to show you how to create the fields for the library system, but the process is the same regardless of what the database is going to store. So this is Access. I've chosen blank database. I've already filled in a name and selected a folder, and I'm just going to click Create. Now the left hand panel shows all the objects within the database, and the common objects you might have are things like tables, forms, queries and reports, and they'll do different things. We've already looked at queries in the previous video. Table stores information, and a table is effectively a mini database inside the overall database file. So what we're going to create inside this database file is 3 tables that represent the 3 entities in our library. So the things we've got are borrowers, we've got books, and we've also got the process of borrowing a book, which we'll call a loan, which will link those 2 things together. So I'm going to take you through the process of creating the 3 tables. So I'll do the first one in detail and show you exactly how to do it, and then I'll run through the others briefly, because once you've done one you can do them all. So the table 1 is one that's created by default by Access when you first open a database, but I think it's easier just to start from scratch. So I'm just going to close that one, and I'm going to go to Create, and I'm going to go to Table Design. So the first thing we need to think about is what pieces of information we're going to store about the entity that we're recording here. So if we do the people first, so the borrowers in the database, in the library, so what would we want to know about them? So want to know their name, so I'm going to store their full name and their surname. Now with some pieces of information in a database, you need to decide whether you're going to split it or whether you're going to have it all as one kind of block. So things like name, you could store the whole name in one field, or you could split it into forename and surname like I'm doing here. There's no right or wrong answer. How you would do it would depend on what you want to do with that information. So if you're ever going to use part of the name, so if you wanted to write a letter to, dear Mr. Smith, then that's just using the surname, so it would make sense to separate them. If you only ever use the name as one kind of block together, storing them in a single file field would make sense. Similarly with the address, you could have one big address block, or you could have separate fields for things like street, town, county, postcode, etc. So just to save space, I'm going to go address. Oops. And then what other things are we going to want to store? So maybe whether they're male or female, so we'll call that gender. How old they are. So you could store age, but the problem with age is it changes every year and you'd have to remember to update it. So a better thing to store would be date of birth, because we've already looked in a previous video at how you can do calculations in queries. So if we know the date of birth, we can work out how old the person is. And then you might want their telephone number. So notice I'm just putting enough of the name in here to remind me what it is. Later on we're going to be looking at forms, so it's unlikely that the user of a database system would actually see these field names, so they just need to remind you what the thing does. So I'm just calling it telephone rather than telephone number. Notice also that you can't put spaces in the field name, so I've called it date of birth with underscores in there. Some people just miss the spaces out entirely and use things like capital letters to separate words. That's fine. Then what else might we include? We might include things like email, I suppose. There might be all sorts of other bits of information you might record in a real library, but for our demonstration this is enough. So the first thing to think about is what we're going to store. The second thing to think about is what's in this second column over here, which is headed data type. And here we're telling Access what type of information to expect in each field. So the forename is text. If we have a look at the other choices, we've got text, memo, number, date and time, currency and auto number. We've also got yes and no. The bottom ones you're unlikely to use, but Access is quite sophisticated, and OLE objects, for example, you can use the database to store sounds or pictures. So the top, from yes and no up, are probably the ones you're most likely to use. And if you choose one, you get some further options down the bottom here. So when you choose text, for example, you get to choose how many characters you want. If you choose number, you get to choose how many decimal places and things like that. So the difference between text and memo is just the size. So memo is also a text field, but it doesn't have a fixed length. So if you want lots of text, or usually if you want text split over multiple lines, like we might do in an address, or if it was paragraphs of text, we would choose memo. So I would say forename and surname are both text, address will go for memo, gender will go for text, date of birth is obviously a date. Telephone is one of those tricky database fields where the name suggests one type, but it's actually another. So telephone number sounds like it's a number, but the thing to remember in databases and indeed programming is numbers can only be numbers. So if you can't do a calculation with it, then it's not a number. So numbers can only have digits and one decimal point in, and possibly a minus sign at the start. So because telephone numbers often include other characters, some people put spaces or hyphens in them, that would make it not a number. Also, the properties of numbers are that any leading zero has no meaning. So 0, 1, for example, in maths is the same as 1, because no tens is just nothing, so we don't need to put that 0. So all telephone numbers in the UK begin with 0. If we were to store those as a number, it would remove that 0 at the start. Similarly with things like credit card numbers and other things that might look like numbers but aren't, the safest thing to do is actually to store them as text, and then obviously email is text as well. So what about the options down the bottom? So by default, text fields are 255 characters long, and you might think, well, that's plenty enough to store a name. But if you store more characters than you need, that's going to make the file bigger than you need. So there's a compromise to be struck between reducing the file size and making sure that the field is big enough for you to store that information. So I've never come across anybody whose name is 255 characters long. The tricky bit is to reduce it to such a point where it's not going to inconvenience anybody whose name is too long. So maybe something like 30 would be a good compromise. I've never met anybody whose name is 30 characters long, but it should allow for most common names while still saving 225 characters worth of space per record. Gender, we do know, if we just want people to enter M or F, then we only need one character, so that's quite easy to arrange. Date of birth, you also get these options with dates of birth, so we can choose the date format, whether it's words or digits, or whether it includes the time, or in fact whether it's only the time. So date of birth, probably short date format, the most appropriate there. Other options include things like input masks, so that's probably not suitable for a date, but if you know that things are always in a particular format, so national insurance number, for example, is always 2 letters, 6 digits and a letter, input mask, you can control that. Default value is the value that appears in the field for a new record by default. So in a loan, for example, today's date might be a good thing to default into the date field, but in this particular case, obviously we can't predict when a person's date of birth will be. We can also put a validation rule on there, so that's we can get the computer to check that the information entered makes sense. So one of the things we could do with the date of birth field is check that it's in the past. So this works very similar to the query criteria. So we can just say that the validation rule is less than, we'll go for less than or equal to. It's unlikely that a baby will come in on the day they're born and register for the library, but you never know. So the date function gives us today's date. So what we're saying there is that the date of birth must be before or equal to today. So you can't have a date of birth in the future. And the validation text is what you want to say if people break those rules. So you could say something like date of birth must be in the past. And and then you could say whether it's required. So it wouldn't make sense for somebody not to enter their name, for example. It might be okay for them not to enter their date of birth if you don't particularly need it. So we've got those sorts of pieces of information in there. Then what we can also do, so if we're looking at gender, in our validation rule, we can do something like this. You can say M or F. So you can use and or, so that would only allow M or F to be typed into that field. But actually, rather than letting somebody enter any value and then checking whether it's the right one afterwards, what you could do is just stop them selecting incorrect information in the first place. So if we go to the Lookup tab, one of the things we can do is choose how this field is going to appear when we're entering the data. So the default option is text box, where we just type the information in, but we've also got the choice of a list box or a combo box. Now they're both multiple choice, but the difference is list box contains only the multiple choice options, and a combo box contains the multiple choice options but allows you to type in a value of your own if there's nothing there that's suitable. So in this particular case, we don't want people typing in their own gender, so I'll just go for list box. We can choose where the choices come from. They can come from a table or a query, or elsewhere in the database, but I'm just going to type in a value list, and what we need to type in is the choices separated by semicolon. So M and F are the choices here, and then there's additional information to say which bit's going to be saved if there's multiple columns, but we don't need to worry about that. So what that'll do is that will just give me a drop-down box with M and F in it when I come to add the data to the table. Okay, so I've stored most of the information that I'll need there. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to save it and switch to the data view so I can type in some borrowers. So the first thing I need to do, well, if I try and do that, what it'll tell me first of all that I need to save the table. So I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to use the Lozinski-Reddick naming convention. I'm going to begin the name TBL, and you'll be able to see why as we add more objects to the database. And I'm going to call it borrower. Because although it's people, there might be other tables containing people. So there might be a table for staff or things like that. So I'm going to click OK. Now it's also telling me that there's no primary key. So I'm going to say, yes, I do want to create one of those. You don't have to have a primary key, but it's good practice. What a primary key is, it's something that's unique or different for every record in the table. Now with people, it's a little bit tricky. So what it's done is it's added one for me there. So I'll just delete that for a minute. So you can create, or you can turn an existing field into a primary key by clicking on it, or if you want to click several, you can hold down the control key and then you click the key on the toolbar. Now you can have a single field or a combination of fields as your primary key, as your unique thing. So if you think about it, a table of people, you're quite likely to have two people with the same surname. So you might have two people called John, or probably more than two. Similarly, you might have two people with the same surname. So you might have lots of people called Smith, for example. A combination of the two is less likely, but you still might have people called John Smith, for example. So you could combine, well, say, well, maybe is it possible to have, two John Smiths living at the same address? Well, it's not impossible, but I suppose we're getting less likely. So you could include date of birth, and are the two John Smiths at the same house, born on the same day? Well, that's getting less likely. So we could use that. It's very difficult to pick an individual thing about a person that should be unique. So you might think, well, telephone, lots of people have got mobiles these days, and mobiles tend not to be shared, but they can be. I know couples, particularly elderly people, who share a mobile. Similarly, some couples share email addresses as well. So you can't guarantee that those things in themselves are unique. Some things like national insurance numbers are unique, but they're not issued until you're 16. There was talk about issuing babies with national insurance numbers, so that could be used as a unique identifier throughout people's lives, but that's not happened yet. So what organisations tend to do is they tend to add extra fields and use those as the unique identifier. So what you get when you join a library is a membership number. So I'll say membership number. Oops. And a membership number could be just a number. It's usually on the back of your card and represented as a barcode, so they don't have to type it in. They can just scan it when you go to the library. But the type of that, if we go for auto number, what that will do is that will enter that information automatically. So the membership number will be allocated each time we add a new person. So if we drag that up to the top, we'll have it first, and then what we'll do is we'll use the key button to make that the primary key. So no two people will have the same membership number, even if they've got the same name, and that will allow us to differentiate between any multiple John Smiths that we might have. Okay, so now we're done, I think. So if we click on View, it's saying we need to save the table again, and we've got the table here, and we've got we always get a blank row at the bottom which will allow you to add a new record. So the membership number, I don't need to add it. If I add somebody called John Smith, for example, so his full name is John, notice it's put the membership number in. We can resize these columns just as we can in Excel, just by dragging the line. Membership number is a little bit of a tricky one because obviously the number itself is quite small, but the heading is quite big. But I think we know what that first one is, so I won't need to make it bigger. So John Smith, and where does he live? Let's say he lives in Warwick. And so here, notice because I said that we were going to use a list box, it's just giving me a choice. I can't enter anything that's not valid. And because I've said this type, the date of birth is a date field, we get this little pop-up calendar when we can select different things. So if I enter its date of birth as tomorrow, it's saying date of birth must be in the past. So that's the validation in action there. So obviously most people are born years ago, so an easier thing is to just type it in. So, and then obviously telephone, just showing you that when we store it as text, it preserves the leading 0. Then to enter a new person, I can, once I've filled in that record, I can click on another row. So I always get this blank row on the next. So as soon as I start this one, we get another blank row at the bottom. The one with the star on it is the next new person. So Joe Bloggs, and he might live in Stratford, and he's a male as well. And when was he born? I don't know, 15th of the 6th. 74, for example, and there we go. So we can add information into the table. Now the whole point of a relational database is that, unlike my previous example in the spreadsheet, each person will only appear in this table once. So even if Joe or John move, so if Joe moves to rugby, we can just edit his one record that appears in the table, and we won't have that inconsistency across the records like we had before. Okay, so we've got the borrower information. We need to do the same thing with books and loans. So if we go to create, and I'll just run through these a bit more quickly. So table design. So if we're going for books, we need to think of something that's unique about a book. Now, books have an ISBN number, and an ISBN number is a 13-character text field. So it's quite often, well, it will be on the back of a book above the barcode. So the barcode on the back of a book represents the ISBN number. I suppose you'd have things like title, which will be text, author, which also be text. So and then we might have things like the price of the book. We might have whether it's a reference book, in which case you can't borrow it. So that would be a good use of a yes or no field. So things like dictionaries and encyclopedias, maps, you can't always take them out of the library. You might have things like classification. So you might be aware of the Dewey Decimal System or other classification systems, the number that's on the spine of the book, so they know where to put it back on the shelf. And then, so that might be a small text number, so maybe 10 characters. Then we might have, what else might we have? Keywords. So if they have a library computer system where you can search for a particular book, so there might be lots of those. So let's have memo. So we could just give you the subject of the book, so when you search you can find all the books on science, even though that science isn't in the title. And then you might have the price on there. So you might have noticed when you get a book from the library, it's got the price on the inside cover usually, so that if you lose it, you have to pay for them to replace it. So we can go for currency there, obviously. So that'd be okay. And then the unique thing about the book will be the ISBN number. So that's going to be the primary key. So we could then, so we need to save that. So we'll just call that table book. And then the other thing we need is some way of linking these together. So you can also use a table to represent a process. So the process here is going to be the loan to link the book to the borrower. So I'm going to create a third field and design the table. So notice you can have multiple tables open at the same time. So when we borrow a book, what will we need to know? Well, we need to know who's borrowing it, but we don't need their name. So what we'll use is the membership number. So when you go and borrow a book, they don't ask you your name, do they? They scan your card or you put your card in the machine. So we'll have, so just see what that's called. So I'll give it the same name just to make things a bit easier. So we want to record who's got the book, so their membership number, and that's a number. Then we'll also want to record which book it is. So that'll be the ISBN, which will be text. You need to be a little bit careful to make sure they're the same, so I'll make them the same length because we're going to link them together in the next video. What you'll need is a bit more information than that, so probably not just who's got the book, but the date they borrowed it, which will obviously be a date. Let's make that a short date. Then date due, and that'll also be a date, obviously. Now these are fields where you could use default values, so let's make that a short date. So if you're borrowing a book, it's likely that you're borrowing it for the current day. So you could say the default value, there's a function called date, which gives you the current date. And when it's due back, well, in my local library, you now only get 3 weeks. So there's a function called date add. So the default value, we could make it 3 weeks time. So you say date add, then you give the units. So you could work in days or weeks. So I'll say date add 21. So we're adding 21 days to the current date. Okay, so that's our default there. Then that might be enough to record the loan, but what we want to we need to know really when that book's come back as well. So we could have something like, we could say returned, yes or no, so we know whether it's come back. That'd be one way of doing it. A better thing to do might be to have the date returned, because if we know the date it was returned, we can compare that with the date due, and we can see how many days overdue it was, and we can use that to calculate any fines that might be due. So obviously we can't default that because we can't predict in advance when the book was going to be brought back, but we can give that a format. So short date, okay. The particularly tricky thing with this field is what the key field is going to be. So is it going to be the membership number? Well, if the membership number was the key field, that would mean that membership number would only be able to occur once in the whole table. So that would mean each member would only be able to borrow one book ever. Similarly, ISBN, if you made ISBN the primary field, primary key, then it would mean that each book could only be borrowed once. Similarly with date out, if date out was the primary key, then each day you'd only be able to lend one book, and you could close at 9:05 once that one book had been lent. So we're probably looking at a combination. So what about the combination of member and book? That sounds like it might be a good choice. But I suppose what might happen there is you might borrow a book, and then you might want to renew it, or you might come back next year and want to borrow the same book again. And if you made that combination unique, you wouldn't be able to do so. So probably the best combination of primary key is the person, the book, and the date. So you could come back on a different date and borrow the same book, but you couldn't borrow it twice on the same day. Now that's unlikely to happen. I know theoretically you could borrow it in the morning, bring it back, and then take it out again in the afternoon, but tough in this particular case. So I've selected all three of those by dragging, but if they weren't next to each other, you could hold down the Control key. On the Design tab, we've got the key, so I'm going to make all three of those, the combination of those three, the primary key. So I'm now going to save that, and I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to call that loan because it contains the loan information. And I'm going to click OK. And if we look at that table, what we'll see is it defaults today's date when I add a new record, and I can say, well, loan person 1, book 1. We haven't got any books in yet, but the date is today's date, and it's due back on the 7th. But we can change that. So if it turns out the 7th, is a day that we're not open, so a bank holiday or something, then we can tweak that slightly. So it's not set in stone, the default value. And then obviously we'll leave the date returned blank until the book actually comes back. So that's the how to create tables in Access, how to set the fields and the field types and any other options, such as whether you want it to be a short date or a list box to choose the options like we did with male or female. So what I'll do is I'll go away and put some data in here, and then we'll come back and we'll have a look at how to link these fields together using something called relationships, and that's really the key step in creating a relational database.